Hi, I'm Adam Zonder, the production manager for the Hangar Theater Company, and welcome to an episode of In Good Spirits. As we have gone virtual for the 2020 summer season and everyone is working from home, I'm currently sitting in an empty theater, which is odd considering it's summertime. However, between the ongoing pandemic and this being my 25th season with the Hangar, we thought having some conversations with the various designers and technicians with whom I have worked over the years would be fun and in good spirits. I need to take a moment to give a big thank you to our series sponsor, Myer Farm Distillers, located in Ovid, New York. Joe and his team produce various award-winning vodkas, gins, and my personal favorite, bourbon. Please check them out at MyerFarmDistillers.com. Today, I'm having a conversation with a dear friend and sound designer, Joanna Staub. How are you today, Joanna?
Good. How are you?
Good. People may not know that you, in addition to working at the Hangar, are also an alum of Ithaca College. So did you go there to be a sound designer?
Not in the outset, no. I was a music major when I first started at Ithaca College, but I was studying music with a minor in audio. And then I went into theater because I met John Bracewell, and he convinced me that I should do live sound. If I was going to do audio engineering, I should do live sound.
Good choice.
Yeah. And so I ended up graduating with a combination degree in plant studies. It is music, television, radio, audio engineering, and live theater was my combination degree by the time I finished.
Great. So is John that sort of convinced you to head into the theater direction?
Yeah. John Bracewell and Peter Rothbart are the two professors at Ithaca College that were kind of like my biggest steering. Because I was a live performer, I enjoyed the live aspect. Just because I wasn't going to be a performer anymore, it was a place for me to still use all of my music background and my interest in live performance and use it all still in just different ways.
Great. So what is it about sound design that you really enjoy, and how do you get excited about a show?
Oh God. It's just kind of second nature to me. I've always listened to how things sound, and it's like I said, with my music background, and I always had a strange interest in technology. I'm really going to date myself, but like I was the person who, like, if the Walkman stopped working, I would rip it apart to see if I could figure out what was wrong with it. Like I never was ever actually able to fix it when I was, 13 years old, but I'd tear it apart and look at it. So I was, in kind of a strange way, it was in a kind of an amalgamation of all of my interests that I just didn't realize was there until, my junior year at Ithaca College. So.
Great. What are some things that people might be surprised to learn about sound design?
I don't know if anything would surprise anybody really, because it's one of those weird parts of theater where everybody thinks they know what they're doing. So as far as surprise, I think I would say mostly the technology. People don't understand that it's, I think, one of the most technological aspects of theater, along with lighting design, where you have to understand the technology in order to fully affect the design work. So the amount of science and acoustics and engineering and technology, you kind of have to be a little bit of all of that stuff. More so than, other aspects where it's like, well, it looks pretty. It's not that you don't have to know how to build a set, but most designers are better at visualizing it. Sound designers are more, I'm not saying this correctly, sound designers are just better at collaborating the execution and the design than some other people are.
I've often thought that sound is the biggest crossover between the two, of design and the practical engineering part.
And I think that's also why a lot of sound designers go back and forth between being designers and technicians. It's very, very common that somebody who's a designer is also mixing shows and also doing other work, because we just walk the line more closely than a lot of other departments do.
Along those lines, so you've also gone back and forth between the two, but is there one that you prefer more than the other?
No, I actually really like doing both. I have stepped away in the last few years from running shows full time, mostly because I did it for so long. I was a technician for 15 years before I kind of slid more towards doing design. And it's kind of an old school framework in the New York City way of doing things for sound designers, which is that you would go from working downtown to working uptown to being an A2 to being a mixer to being an associate to being a designer. And most of the people who are, I'm kind of the last generation that did that. Whereas now kids will come out of college and go straight to assistant designing. We used to always that was a job you worked up to. So I guess I'm just kind of the last generation that fell into that mold, where I look at it as a progression. I've done my time mixing shows. I've done my time as an A2. But I still love mixing shows. I mean, it's been about, I want to say almost 3 years since I mixed a Broadway show. But I love it. I love sitting at that console and having the connection with the actors that the mixers do. But what I was getting tired of was doing the same show 8 times a week. There was actually a night where I was sitting in a show and I was mixing, and all of a sudden I realized we were halfway through Act 1 and I had no idea how we'd gotten there. I had just been kind of going off muscle memory, and that's not good. And that's when I kind of went, maybe it's time to look for a different way to do this. So.
Yeah, I've always thought it would be hard after, a few months of doing the same show to continue being excited about doing the same show.
It depends on the show. I mean, I did some shows. I mean, the show that I mixed the longest was Les Mis. I was on the 2005 revival, the first revival of Les Mis. And I mixed about 500, somewhere between 500 and 600 performances of that. And I loved it, but it's because we were working with a great company and we were working with really amazing people and going to work every day. It was almost like doing a cubicle job where you show up and do your job every day. And if you're around people that you like, it's easy. And I was splitting the shows with Patrick Pummel at the time. So we were each doing 4 shows a week as far as mixing front of house.
Well, that helps.
Yeah. And so it was, running the show day to day was great. And I loved it. But then I think, the show that I referred to earlier where I wasn't as happy wasn't an enjoyable show to go into work every day. Everybody was grumpy and you're kind of just like, oh, I don't want to be here. So that mixing that show was, and I was also mixing 8 shows a week on that show. I didn't have a sub. So it's a different way of looking at it. Who you're working with and the group of people you're with has a lot to do with whether or not 8 shows a week is sustainable.
Right. With Les Mis and splitting it, so were you then not at all on the show for 4 performances, or were you doing a different job?
No, the way it works on Broadway is that whoever's mixing front of house on the show, usually the person who's backstage running wireless microphones is the second mixer on the show, and you'll just switch positions. On most shows, the head of audio will usually mix 5 or 6 performances a week, and the sub or the A2 will mix the other 2 to 3 shows a week. It's just that because Les Mis is such a long show, I was actually the A2 on the show at the time, but my boss was of the opinion that it was a show that we should mix 50-50 because it was too hard for me to maintain a mix, only doing 2 to 3 shows a week.
Got it.
So, and also he just was okay with me mixing half the shows a week. So it was fine.
That's great. That's great. So you were just talking about A1, A2, and A3. Can you just briefly explain that for the audience?
Sure. The A1 is the person, in traditional terms, is the person who's in charge of the sound department. They are also almost always the person who you will see sitting at the console mixing the show, throwing the faders. Mm-hmm. Then the A2 is the first person backstage, who is usually in charge of the wireless microphones and also the orchestra pit and making sure that everything is running smoothly backstage. And as I said, that's often the person who's also the backup front of house engineer, because you never want to have only one person that can do a job on a show. It's just like understudies. If there's only one person who can mix a show and something happens to that person, you can't have a show. So we always make sure there's a second person to do it, and it's usually the person who's backstage. And then you mentioned A3s. A3s are a little hit or miss. On really big shows, there's an A3. And it's often just a second assistant backstage to help with running wireless mics and doing the band. It can also be somebody who's mixing monitors if there's an onstage monitor system in the show. So Great. There's various ways an A3 can be implemented.
Great. So your first season, I believe, at the Hangar was 1998 with the sound design for To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, depends if you want to argue this point. Technically, my first show at the season at the Hangar was 1992.
With what?
I was an intern in 1992. I mixed all the shows that season.
Fantastic. I had no idea, but that predates me.
Yes, yes. The summer that I was between my sophomore and junior years at Ithaca, I was the sound design intern at the Hangar Theater.
Great. I think I knew that, but I kind of forgotten.
Now you have to go
Again,
back
because it predates me. So, okay. Well, your first time as a designer was To Kill a Mockingbird in 1998.
Correct.
Do you have any recollections of that specific production?
You know, I kind of remember a lot of things and nothing at all about it. It's very weird. It was one of my first designs post grad school. That's one of the big things that I remember, is because I had finished graduate school in December of 1997. So it was only about 6 months out of school. And I had been working in New York City off Broadway, mixing shows. And I don't even remember. I think it was your assistant got me the design somehow. I don't remember. Stephen Cummings, I think, had something to do with it.
Oh, he was the TD.
He was the TD. Okay, so the TD helped me get the job. And I came back up and designed it. And I remember kind of being a little bit terrified because it was my first, like, here's your first professional design. It didn't matter that it was in a theater that I'd worked in before, in a town that I knew really well. It was just kind of this, oh, geez, this is what I'm doing. Okay. And I do remember kind of at the end thanking everybody for being nice to me. And
hey, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and everybody kind of looking at me going, you were fine, what's the problem? But I think that's what I remember the most about that summer was, and it was also, I seem to recall I was hired very last minute, like you had lost your designer and I was brought in or something like that. So,
yeah, I think that is true.
Yeah.
On that for some reason.
It was kind of a little crazy, but good.
You then returned a few years later and designed the premiere of Josh Keenan Comes Out to the World, which was our school tour in the fall of 2002.
God, there wasn't, okay.
Yeah, it was. So because that was a premiere in a new play, how do you find working on new plays versus established ones?
Oh, I love working on new plays because it gives you so much more ability to do things. You're not so tied in to, you know, what people don't realize is if you pick up a script and you read a script and there's a note in it that says sound of water here, that's almost never the playwright's intentions. It's notes from the first design. And so when you're sound designing, you kind of have to ignore those notes because you're just reading what a previous designer had done. And so when you get a truly new play, you get to start from scratch. There's no preconceived ideas of what should be happening. And that's what I really like about it. And I do seem to recall that Josh Keenan was a little crazy. And if you're right, it was my first show with Kevin Moriarty.
Yes.
And Kevin is one of those directors who, for the most part, likes collaboration between departments. And I really remember, and I know we teched that show in the Horner Theater up on campus. And I just remember it being one of those kind of crazy situations where everybody threw ideas at each other and about each other's departments and it stuck. And especially that show, especially the sound design was made up of very, very hip, like current music. And I wasn't even up to speed on some of this music. And Kevin and our costume designer and like other people had all these really great ideas. And it just was a really lovely collaboration of like, let's have a good time. And we edited music and sampled music till we were blue on that show. And it was one of those really fun shows to sound design.
That's great. So after that, you then designed a few large musicals or large plays with music here, such as Hello Dolly, As You Like It, The Wiz, and Cats, and one smaller show, Sammy and Me. Again, another new play. So how do you find the difference with show size affecting your designs?
I mean, conceptually, it doesn't change it at all. Like when I will come in, I think Sammy and Me, I mean, I kind of laugh for you saying Sammy and Me was a small show because it wasn't really. It had a smaller band, but it had 200 sound effects in it.
Right, but one human.
With one human, exactly. One-man shows are usually the hardest to sound design because they do involve a lot of tech. But, you know, I often will approach a show with like, let's think of everything we could possibly do. And then you look at the budget and go, okay, this is what we can actually do. And so I I don't initiate my design concepts based on budget. Because I like to come up with as many ideas as we possibly can, and then figure out what needs to be adjusted for whatever purpose. If that makes sense. I don't know if it does or not. Okay.
Absolutely. So since you've done such a wide range of shows, do you have a preference for musicals versus non-musicals?
Oh, I way prefer doing musicals. I very, very much prefer doing musicals. When you get a play that's really like Sammy and Me, that's very, very sound intensive, I love it. But I'm a musician at heart, and I want to play with musicals. I want to play from a fun aspect to do musicals, because that's just where my background is. Listening to the music, listening to scores, orchestrations, voices, like that's way more what I want to do. So it unfortunately just one of those things it's been a hard place for women to get into in our industry. It's a very male dominated end of sound design.
Well, you seem to be doing okay with the number of associate sound design and assistant sound design credits on Broadway.
We got to get the associate title out of my title still.
I understand. I understand, and hopefully that will happen. But could you actually briefly explain the difference between associate and assistant?
Oh, that's easy. An associate is allowed to make decisions if the designer is not in the room, and an assistant will have to call the designer to find out what the answer is if they're not in the room. That's kind of the way I look at it. That's the delineation. As far as tasks and jobs and assignments, everybody goes and gets coffee at this point. So that's a non-issue. Who's doing the paperwork, who's doing the drafting could be anybody, depending from team to team. But I think it's just about acceptance of responsibility that's the problem. And so it's just the amount of responsibility you take on.
Great. So with those shows, being the associate or the assistant on the Broadway shows, it also means that you work on when the shows go out on tour, right?
Yes.
So you have to adapt the design, or are you actually touring?
It depends. I mean, I have toured as a technician, as a stagehand and a mixer, but I've also associate designed tours. So it depends which job I'm being hired for. Mm-hmm. I haven't actually toured in quite a while as a technician, but I have just, in the last few years, associate designed touring shows. And the big thing is, it depends on who you're working with. The most recent tour that I put out was a show called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which is primarily a British design show. And British designers don't know how we tour in the States. It's different than how they tour in Europe and the UK. So most of that show was about me teaching the designer what we had to do to make it work in our system, in our manner of handling things in the States. In general, associate designing is making sure somebody else's ideas get executed. I always kind of jokingly refer to it as, it's a Star Trek joke. Captain Picard would always come up with these really screwed up ideas, but you never saw him execute them. He'd turn to the guy standing next to him and say, "Make it so." When you're the associate designer, you're the make it so person. Which I'm not sure if it's number one or number two. I'm not actually a Star Trek person, but that's kind of the analogy. You're the make it so person. Mm-hmm. And that's when you're an associate designer, that's what you spend a lot of time doing.
Got it. So you mentioned Curious Incident. So you were also the associate when it came to Broadway as well.
Correct.
Right. So what was that experience like, transferring a show out of the West End to Broadway?
I mean, Curious Incident was like the 10th or 12th show in a long line of me transferring shows from the West End. Mm-hmm. I kind of got into a clique of doing that for a little while in my career, and I loved it. I was really fortunate to work on some really amazing shows, and that's kind of the biggest thing about my career, is that I have worked on really great theater, and not just, it's not the jukebox musicals aren't useful, but everything has its place. But I've worked on really good theater on Broadway, as opposed to just entertainment, because I think those are two different things. And so, Curious was just another one of those processes. Sometimes I would fly to London and see the show in London and then look at what the designers wanted to accomplish and then say, this is what I would suggest we change. This is what I think we can do. And just the trick is working with people who trust you. I mean, I worked with 5 or 6 British designers on transfers to Broadway, and some of them trusted me more than others. And Ian Dickinson, who's the sound designer of Curious Incident, that was our 4th show together. So he just trusted me. He's like, here you go, make it happen. And Curious Incident is a huge sound show. So there was a lot of work. And also I had a gentleman, there's an associate designer in London who I would work very closely with him in transferring the shows as well. So it's just kind of the make it so scenario and just helping them, maybe change out a couple pieces of gear because we don't carry it in the States or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Is there a big difference between transferring a show from the West End to Broadway and a show just going to Broadway from the States?
The thing is, it's very, very rare that shows go straight to Broadway anymore. I've transferred shows from Chicago to Broadway, right. Which is almost the same as transferring a show from the West End. I think Promises, Promises was the last show we originated on Broadway that I worked on. And, and that's just like doing theater. But it's just, it almost never happens anymore. It's just too expensive to originate a show on Broadway. We don't have the time to tech things and work it out. So yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's just kind of, it's just not something that happens very often anymore.
Well, actually, let me just ask this then. So if shows are, starting somewhere else in the United States and then going to Broadway, how big are the changes?
It depends on the show. It really does. I was very fortunate to work on August Osage County when it moved to Broadway from the Steppenwolf. And, the tech of the show barely changed at all. The script actually went through some huge rewrites. The 3rd act of the show went through substantial rewrites between Chicago and Broadway. So in that sense, like, we just kind of sat around and watched Tracy rewrite script pages. And the technology that we put in for the show didn't really change. Even Curious Incident did go through some script rewrites. And I do know that we had like 1 or 2 moments where it was like, oh, we've rewritten something here. Now we have to figure out the tech. And it just depends on who you're in the room with. Marianne Elliott, who's the director of Curious Incident, was really great about, we've rewritten this scene. How are we going to finish? How are we going to technologically support the storytelling? I very much like working in rooms where the director says, hey, everybody, let's get together and figure this out. And everybody kind of spitballs ideas until you come up with a plan. And when the video designer trusts the sound designer's input and the set designer and costume, like everybody's working together, it's so much more fun. And I actually think it creates better theater. That's one of kind of my big gripes about New York theater right now, is that we very often create shows without the design team in the room. Like the designers will design the shows on paper and then send their associate designers to the room to do the work. And then when you want to make a change, it's like the B team that's making the changes. And it makes for some very uncohesive theater. Again, which is part of why we don't do it in New York anymore. Like we do all that out of town where it's cheaper. And so I just think it depends. It really depends on how we're approaching a show and who the leader in the room is.
Great. So earlier you mentioned about the lack of female sound designers as like the sound designer on Broadway. Yeah. You obviously have a lot of associate credits, but do you see that heading in a better direction or not at all? Because obviously we all know that sound went away from being a Tony Award for a little bit and has finally come back.
Right. I mean, I hope it's changing. It's terrible. I mean, it shows how far I am into the argument that I can toss these numbers around, but on average, 97% of all Broadway shows are designed by white men. And that's horrid.
Mm-hmm. And that's not just sound, right?
No, just sound.
Just sound? Okay.
That's only sound design. On Broadway, 97% of shows are designed by white men. In regional theater, it's something like 94% are. And so we, as far as diversity, both culture, ethnic diversity and gender diversity are really the worst offenders in theater of not having enough people in the room. And especially on Broadway, it's such a clique. And I don't want to make it sound like I blame the guys, because I don't. I actually think it's a producer situation on Broadway where they just hire the same, they hire the same sound designers. They hire the people who they're comfortable with. They hire the people they know. And so it means that a majority of the shows on Broadway are designed by the same 10 people. If it's 10, it's more like 7 or 6. At one point, about a year and a half ago, one sound designer had a third of all the shows on Broadway.
Wow.
And that happens periodically, that one designer just becomes in fashion and all the producers hire them. So as far as, we're a little better with plays, especially in the last 2 years, because we all started screaming about 2 years ago about the lack of diversity in sound design. And so plays have gotten a little bit better, but still to this day, I believe it's only 3 women have ever been hired to sound design a Broadway musical. I may be wrong about that. It might only be 2. And neither one of them did it on their own. They were both hired as the co-designer with a male sound designer. So it's a really bad situation that we are fighting really hard to try to fix right now. The encouraging thing is, in January, I took a really great meeting with some new young general managers, female general managers, who looked at me and went, "So why is it like this?" And I basically said the same thing I just said here. And she went, "So if we're going to change this, we just need to hire people, right?" And I went, "Yes, that'd be great." And we started talking about, it's not a pipeline problem. There's plenty of women who can do this job. You just have to hire them. And then the world broke. So
Yes, it did.
Maybe once we get back to work, that there will be some new people willing to hire some new people. And so hopefully there'll be some change.
That would be fantastic if that actually occurs.
Yes.
But I mean, along those lines, it took a very long time for sound to also be recognized by unions, like USA.
Yes and no. There's a little bit of a history lesson there if you want me to get into it. I'm not.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It's sound designers were accepted into USA, I believe, in the late 1980s. Don't quote me on that. I mean, I might be, but time frame-ish somewhere in there. But only in regional theater. The Broadway was the problem. And it was about the same time that Broadway did, sound designers on Broadway did have representation, but we were covered under Local 1. So we were considered, the sound designers were under the same contracts as the stagehands.
Okay.
And unfortunately, Local 1 just wasn't equipped to support the designers. I don't know a whole lot about the background history of why that happened, but it had something to do with just the union weirdness. But somewhere in the early 2000s, the president of Local 1 kind of raised his hand and went, "This is stupid." And Local 1 went to USA 29 and said, "We would love to give you these sound designers." And then at that point, we renegotiated a new contract and we switched jurisdiction. So it's not that sound designers, weren't part of the union. We were just this weird nebulous blob that floated around between a bunch of places. And it was only until like the early 2000s that we made some hard changes to have us treated like the rest of the design team. And it was only last year that we now negotiate our contract on Broadway along with all the other designers. We used to have a separate contract from everybody else.
That seems really silly.
Yeah. But it's because of the way we came in, we had to have a different contract. And it took 15 years almost to meld the 2 contracts together.
Really? I could have done that in an afternoon on a spreadsheet.
Oh, no idea.
No, because I remember you telling me about the quote unquote test to get into USA, which obviously meant I now know that you were actually talking about the new-ish version when it moved from IA.
Yes. Yeah. And I learned, I think I learned a funny story since you and I had that conversation.
Oh, what's that?
Um, because when I took my test to get into the union, I mean, it's basically like you take a little weird little test, and then it's mostly about an interview. It's mostly about showing your portfolio in an interview, which is a little hard for sound designers to do. Um, and I found out after the fact, when I went in to take my USA interview, there were like 15 people sitting around the table, and it was literally a who's who of everybody who'd done Broadway sound for the past 25 years. And I came to find out that they had used me as the litmus test. Like, everybody sitting at the table knew that they were going to let me into the union. Like, it wasn't even a question, but they wanted to use me as the litmus test to see how I handled the testing process, so that they could make decisions about how to do it consistently and fairly. And I was apparently their test monkey.
So you were the guinea pig.
Yeah. Yeah.
Clearly it worked out just fine.
I mean, I mixed shows for almost everybody sitting at the table. That was the catch. Like, almost everybody sitting at that table knew me from somewhere along the line.
Great. So since obviously theater in general is hugely affected by, the pandemic and everything, but sound really will be, because of close proximity with actors and microphones, and entirely possible that we may end up having to mic actors while face masked in the future. What are some of your thoughts about where it might be heading when we can actually, recongregate in a theater again?
I mean, it's tricky. It's really tricky. Because I think you have to look at it from a couple different directions. I think the easier one for me to start from is the audiences, because if we're talking about plexiglass dividers between seats, like, that's the big one that the sound designer will lose their mind over. Spaced seating is no big deal. You're just going to make sure that every seat has the same sound, which is what we do now anyway. It's when people start talking about subdividing the theater that it will be problematic for sound designers. And I think it's going to be a shock to producers' systems if they make the decision to subdivide their theaters to help with distancing audience members, that the sound designers are going to start demanding changing the way we put together sound systems, which may end up becoming a bigger expense. Because there's nothing that will make audience members angry faster than not being able to understand what the cast members are saying. And that's an enormously large part of the sound designer's job, is to make sure that the words are getting to the audience members. So those sort of changes in the architecture of our theaters is something that's going to fall on sound designers to deal with, whether the producers realize it or not yet. Now, as far as, I honestly am of the opinion, I don't know how we do a musical until all of this is over. Because no singer, I can't imagine what voice teachers feel about singing with masks on, because it's going to completely change the way singers sing. And we have spent many years as sound designers and finding ways to mic actors to best support the style of singing that people are doing currently. And if we start putting masks into play, it's going to just change the rules again, and you're going to have to give us some time to figure it out. There are organizations, with USITT and TSDTA and some of the other technological organizations that are already doing research about how do you mic somebody wearing a mask and still make it sound okay. But it has to do with physics, and this goes back to all the weird stuff sound designers have to understand. There's physics to the way sound comes out of a mouth without a mask versus sound coming out of a mouth with a mask. And so it's going to have to change the technology that we use to mic actors, and then how we physically put the mics on the actors to pick up the sound. And it took us a while to figure out how to do it the way we were doing it now, and now we're going to have to rework it. So I just think it's one of those things that you're going to have to be patient while we figure it out. But I think that's what the whole theater is doing right now.
Yeah, we're going to have to be patient about figuring out a lot of this.
Exactly. Exactly.
Absolutely. So let me ask this related to, you were saying spending a lot of time figuring out how to mic the actors. Obviously, when the audience goes to see shows, they will see microphones, coming around, or down from the forehead.
Mhm.
As a sound designer, which is your preference or preferred method, or why?
There is no preferred method. I believe that you have to design for the situation. I'm not going to put a mic in a Madonna, boom microphone for a Gilbert and Sullivan show unless I have to, because
Right.
that's not the style, that's not the look. If I'm doing a classical musical, I'm going to try to hide the microphones as much as I can. I only do this look when it's called with the aesthetic of the show. And the fact of the matter is, we have the technology to mic in different manners, and I think that the miking becomes part of the aesthetic of the look of the show. And you have to be willing to deal with it. Now, on the flip side of that is, if you're working with a show with weaker singers, you have to use the boom microphones, because that's part of that has to do with just picking up the amount of sound coming out of the mouth versus the amount of sound that's on the stage. So it really is, it depends from time to time, and I also do think it depends stylistically on the type of show and also the singers. So you're balancing all of those kind of different reasons that you make choices for a show.
So you were saying the aesthetics of the mic placement rather.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously you were then working closely with like the costume designer, because obviously they're creating a look, and the microphone, if it's visible, will obviously add to
Mm-hmm.
that look.
Yes.
So how did those conversations tend to work a little bit?
I mean, I think it's something, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the costume designer would immediately freak out if you started talking about boom microphones. Now they're aware of it. They've become more educated about why we do it and for the reasons that we do it. And it just becomes a conversation between usually the director, the costume designer, sometimes the musical director, and the sound designer about why we make the choices that we make. And you just make the decisions earlier on. And I feel perfectly comfortable saying, this is a show that I really think we need to use boom mics. And if the director and the costume designer push back with me on it, I'll be like, great, that's fine that we're making that decision, but here's the ramifications of that choice. I work a lot in pro and con lists. And if the pros of not using a boom mic outweigh the cons of it, then we'll make that decision. As long as I fight very hard to make sure everybody in the room just knows what the pros and cons are at the time.
Great. That's super interesting. Cool. Well, I'd like to once again thank our sponsor, Meyer Farm Distillers. Thank you very much for joining me today, Joanna. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.